This question's for Daniel. I haven't read the later translated stuff by Karatani. I've just read the Transcritique book. Is curious, because you invoked Joshua Clover and so on. I'm curious to what extent what he's talking about sounds like, in terms of new modes of exchange, what people call communization, right? The idea that rather than see, coming out of things like Occupy Oakland specifically, the idea that in order to overturn capitalism, you need to break the commodity form almost immediately and begin to set up new relations of appropriation and distribution, tied in with Clover's ideas about riots and about the idea that looting itself is a directly political restructuring of an engagement with distribution.
Yeah. Should I respond now, or should we take a few more? I can jump in very quickly unless others want to. I know last time we had multiple questions. So should we take a few more, Jason?
I don't see any others right now, so why don't we start with that one and maybe get people time to think
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think to address the linkage between Karatani's emphasis on exchange as the privileged mode of resistance to the dominance of commodity exchange within our world, I think one area of productive study would be to look at the way in which circulation struggles, as Clover theorizes them in his book, which he's using the standpoint of world systems theory. And in world systems theory, we've entered into a systemic crisis from about 1973 to the present in the space of financial capitalism. And the funny thing about that is precisely that in the prior world systems, the systemic crisis of circulation struggles also occur when the world system enters into its financial stage, precisely because labor is decentered from its position of autonomy. And so I think that from a certain standpoint, it's very interesting to see the Kantian emphasis that Karatani brings to human freedom and resistance by thinking that in today's capitalist system, most effective struggles will actually be at the site of exchange, precisely because this is about, a wider argument about the potential communal realization and enactment of proletarian subjectivity, right? So I found that argument quite compelling, but also provocative. So.
Thank you very much for both papers and participating in the conference through. This is really difficult on the other side. I understand because I've been there also. When I was thinking about Karatani's work, maybe this is sort of an earlier version that appeared in Rethinking Marxism. So I didn't read the recent book, but that book's earlier version was there. The lesson I took out of it is that the intersection is the sort of key point, right? That is the nation state and capital, which means that there is a constant presence of the nation and the state in the capital, right? In the sense that, yes, we can think about circulation as sort of, there's a tendency for us to prioritize that, but in a way, there's a persistence of the state, and I always read Karatani's work as reminding us the persistence of the state, the sovereign moment, even at the very heart of capitalism, right? In that sense, when you're saying, positing these struggles of circulation, the other, of course, question is the populism, the return on populism, return of geopolitics, both on the left and the right, in terms of capturing the state, right? There is actually a interesting other dimension is also happening. And it allows, maybe Karatani's framework kind of allows that as well, to think about that being always still in play. I'm just as an engagement.
Yeah. I think I heard, unfortunately, only like 50% of the question because of audio, but I can just respond by making a wager, which is that one way to think about Karatani's mode D is this sort of in line with Alain Badiou's notion of what's called subtractive politics, right? Which is to organize a series of political organization precisely outside of the state form. So he's absolutely in line with that sort of vision, which I think was a vision that developed in the early 90s as the Soviet Union collapsed. And this kind of subtractive politics is very much in line with Karatani's, you know? And so it almost seems that, yes, that form of thinking politics does not give us much in today's left-wing and right-wing populism, precisely because they are so enmeshed with the imaginary form of the state. So I think perhaps they're giving us some alternative model to left populism that's worth thinking through, I would say.
Yes, I'm understandable. My question is a little bit related to the last one. So if you think about the original accumulation in Marx, then the thought is that in order to realize capital accumulation, we have to think a violent state intervention at the beginning, which makes it possible to produce surplus value, because the worker has to be, as Marx says separated from the mode of production. And this is what you cannot organize in the production itself. So you need a liberal law, you need a violent state intervention, as he says. So and to put it a little bit differently, like Nancy Fraser tries to think this with Polanyi and Marx. So if we want to think the social, we have to think social totality. And to think social totality means to think, of course, the mediation through the commodity form in the economical sphere. But in order to create value as in the form of commodity, we have to think something which is not fully integrated in the economical. And Fraser calls this nature or care work with regard to the formation of subjectivity. So this is not completely internal to the economical value production. So this means Marx's claim and also Fraser in a certain way is we have to think something like state interventions which is not fully integrated in the economical sphere in order to reproduce the capital in the logic you described. So my question is only how you would describe this dimension which cannot be fully integrated in the economical sphere, even if it reproduces the economical sphere and is destabilized by the economical sphere at the same time. So because there is also a side of commodified care work or commodified nature exploitation. So if you say with Kant there is an unsocial sociability, maybe there is also a non-commodified commodability, or if you want to call it like this.
That was excellent. I fully enjoy the linkage of unsocial sociability from the fourth thesis of the idea of history from a cosmopolitan, from Kant to Freud, and thinking that relation, I mean, in part I like it because it drives all the liberal American Kantians crazy, to put forward the wager that we cannot think categorical imperative within a society dictated by commodity exchange, which basically the consequence is, what are you doing as Kantians? So I think that's a very useful opening of a way to think this logic, but I apologize, I can't respond to your question. I didn't hear enough of it because of the audio is too low. I don't know if Julie, you wanted to jump in with some thoughts on this.
Can you hear me now? Yes. Yeah, I'm in about the same situation as you. I have trouble fully understanding the questions for technical reasons, unfortunately. What I noted in the question, I don't know if that was right of me, is the question of the linkage between state intervention and the economical sphere. And to me, that would be the question of, well, the democratic forms of organization of the state and the economic sphere, which up until the 70s seemed to be perfectly aligned and to work hand in hand, so to speak, towards the betterment of both. Like the state would allow the economic sphere to prosper and invertly, but now it seems that the economic sphere has, gone on of its own, and that the state is no longer finding its, is no longer doing well in this association of state and economics, right? So one might think you might think what you want about the state, that it's not a good form of organization, but however, it is what is left today as the protection of democracies, right? Or just put it this way, human rights. And I'm not able to articulate a full answer, but I don't know. Does it make any sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I'm afraid not much, but anyways, what I want to say is that the economic sphere is disconnected from the state now, and that, I'm going to shut up now.
Yes, this is right. What you said at the end, but I think this disconnection you describe is so of the economical sphere has to be produced. So this is what Marx wants to say at the very end of the first volume in the Capital, in saying there has to be violent state interventions in order to put in work this kind of capital accumulation you both referred to. So this is not something which can be organized completely internal to the economical sphere. There has to be a certain liberal state and a specific form of law which allows this independency you described at the end. So it's not something given, it has to be produced, and this means it cannot be produced internal to the economical organization alone. So this is what Marx calls a genetical history of the capital. So we have to think a genetical description of how this value production can actually work. You described in your in both talks.
Jason, maybe you could summarize for us a little so we could hear it better, because we catch about 50% of the comments.
Okay, I don't know why. Is this mic working?
We can hear you much better.
Okay, I don't know if I can do it justice. I mean, part of the question had to do with the fact that the states a relative autonomy vis-a-vis the market is something that has to be produced rather than assumed. You know, this goes back to what the role of the state in terms of primitive accumulation was, so that the state and the commodity form are not two separate things, but are necessary conditions of each other. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is absolutely the case. Yeah. Okay. So this is more of a comment. I apologize. This.
What?
Yes, but in your both description, it seemed more internal only to the economical sphere in the first instance. So not so much, it was not so much focused on the political. It was not so much focused on the political conditions for this economical value production you described.
Did you guys hear that?
No.
That you focus more on the economic production of value rather than the political conditions of the economic production of value.
Right. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think in the Borromean knot of state-nation capital in advanced capitalism such as our own time, the sovereign that dictates the logic of exchange, what's placed in the privileged position is actually money as an equivalential form. It's not the state form, right? The state form only goes to support that and to allow for its free exchange to coexist and to flourish as much as possible, right? Despite the degradations that it produces. So, yeah, in this sense, he's giving us a very fascinating anti-statist vision of the enactment of socialism, right? One in which I think has many entanglements and many challenges, precisely because are we talking about, you know, boycotts of consumer capitalism and the creation of alternative communities which reproduce the same commodity logic and can't escape them? If we are, this is more problematic, but I think what I'm also trying to suggest is that we can read his wider theory of history, maybe more in line with, as Jason said, some of these communization theories which talk about the true enactment of federations of communes. That's very fascinating to me, and I think very much in line with the Karatanian thesis of history, and so there might be a sort of very fascinating linkage to be thought about there. But I'm also recognizing Julie's talk on Lyotard has many parallels to this question, it seems to me, especially with the lecture you mentioned at the very end with Arendt and totalitarianism. I found all of that stuff incredibly fascinating.
Well, thanks. I don't know. I mean, the Karatani I never read before, and this is all very new to me. And I would definitely want to read more and hear more about this question of communization and the question of federations of communes. However, and for personal reasons, I'm very attached to this idea of federation of communes. However, I don't see how to reconcile that with Lyotard, or rather, I really want to reconcile that, but I haven't managed yet. Because it seems to me that both the libidinal framework in Lyotard and his later framework and his political activism prevent from actually believing the hope of this as a sustainable alternative to, of course, on a local scale, that's possible. But when you read him, the force of the system of, you call it as you want, may it be, energetic forces, capitalism, whatever. It's so powerful, and it also has such a plastic power to adapt to any impediment that it encounters, that it makes the, any other alternative organization of exchange of social relations not easily credible.
Yeah. No, I certainly see that. Yeah. It's I remember reading his Libidinal Economy text, and I found that this notion that Klosowski develops in his 1970 book, Living Currency, the notion of the phantasm, is very interesting, because Lyotard provides huge skepticism about whether we can adequately think exchange within the idea of libidinal economy, because if it becomes an exchange at the level of jouissance, it's precisely unexchangeable, right? And so there is a certain enforced perversion, and I think this is part of the reason why he declared this his evil book, which is a highly pessimistic idea about the very notion of alternative forms of exchange. When you think the ubiquity of commodity, even at the level of the body and the body's enjoyment, you fall into a kind of a cave, a tunnel of a no way out, some sense. So I agree it's an evil book, but I'm very fascinated with his later splitting from it, as you articulated it. And I think there's something very valuable there. But I wonder if you think, Julie, it remains useful within his theory of libidinal economy. Is it still too pessimistic in some sense? Or is there something usable here for emancipation? Or does he, you know what I mean? It seems he casts too much doubt on that for me.
Yeah, well, and part of my trouble answering is also that I've been trying to reconcile the libidinal framework with his later thinking and reassessment also of his own political activism and his own, loss of faith within, how do you say, conseilliste in English, the faith in spontaneous forms that would happen through councils. So actually the end of his text on Arendt ends with an assessment of her own positions with respect to spontaneous politics. And he mentions, actually I haven't been able yet to find what events it was exactly referring to, but apparently she saw in the 60s or 70s when during civil rights movement, she took position in favor of basically white supremacists who would defend their own right to refuse for the kids to go to school with black kids. And he mentioned that story as because she takes this position based on her reading of the Kantian judgment, and so I would have to go to the text there to be more detailed about this. But basically, she says that the right to self-determination is linked to what she calls natality, and which he claims would have to do with a certain theory of the drives. And of course, this cannot do, because just claiming that Selbstbehauptung, the self-determination in itself is good, as opposed to the state, as opposed to other forms of exchange because they happen communally, this cannot be sufficient because it can be either left-wing and towards emancipation, but it can also be for the worst reasons possible. This is why I think, the question of populism today, populism in a very strict sense, but also self-determination should be taken carefully. And I really want to believe in them. And yet, I think I would need more time to think about what they really entail. And I think we should go with great caution there.
Okay, so I think that's a note to end on, great caution. Join me in thanking both Daniel and Julie for presenting and for dealing with all the technical limitations that we had presented, and thank everyone for sticking out a long day. Another one tomorrow. Thank you.